My husband demanded a divorce right at his promotion party while his colleagues were raising their glasses to celebrate. I calmly signed the papers, set the pen down as if it weighed nothing, and softly said, "You have no idea what you just did." 1 month later, he would. The rooftop bar overlooked Canary Wharf, a grid of glass and light stretching into the damp London night. The skyline shimmered like a promise, the kind people chase for years and sometimes never quite reach. Inside, beneath a canopy of string lights and polished steel, the room buzzed with congratulations, laughter, the crisp clink of Bollinger flutes, and the low hum of ambition that always seems to gather around success. My husband stood at the center of it all, Julian Thorne, newly promoted managing director, smiling with a confidence that looked earned, but wasn't entirely his. I watched him from a few steps away, my back straight, my expression composed, my fingers lightly wrapped around a glass I hadn't tasted. People came up to him in waves, shaking his hand, clapping him on the shoulder, praising his vision, his leadership, his brilliant execution. I recognized some of the phrases. I had written them in earlier drafts of presentations, long nights at our dining table in Kensington when he would pace, and I would quietly reshape his thoughts into something sharper, something convincing, something that could survive a boardroom. No one knew that, of course. That had always been the arrangement, unspoken, efficient, invisible. Julian caught my eye across the room and lifted his glass in a brief acknowledgement. Not quite a smile, not quite gratitude, more like recognition of a role fulfilled. I nodded back the gesture. Small, almost imperceptible. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. He believed this night belonged entirely to him. Alara Sterling, one of his colleagues, said, stepping beside me. He was younger, eager, already half drunk on proximity to power. "You must be proud. Julian's been smashing it lately." "I'm happy for him," I replied, my voice even warm enough to pass, cool enough to protect me. He nodded, satisfied, then drifted back into the crowd, and I was alone again, which suited me. I had always been good at standing just outside the spotlight, close enough to see everything clearly, far enough to avoid being seen. The speeches began shortly after. A senior partner took the floor, his tone polished, his words carefully measured. He spoke about growth, about leadership, about the future of the firm, and then he turned to Julian, inviting him forward. Applause swelled, genuine and loud, and Julian stepped up with the ease of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times. He thanked the leadership team, his mentors, his colleagues. He spoke about late nights and difficult decisions, about perseverance and belief. He did not mention me. That wasn't unusual, he rarely did, but tonight the omission felt deliberate, like a line drawn. "And finally," he said, pausing just long enough to gather the room's full attention, "I want to acknowledge something personal." There was a subtle shift in the air, a collective lean in. I felt it before I understood it. "My marriage," he continued, his tone softening into something that mimicked sincerity, "has reached a point where we both deserve to move on." A few people exchanged glances. Others looked at me, then quickly away, as if eye contact might implicate them in something uncomfortable. Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin envelope. "Alara," he said, looking directly at me now, his expression calm, almost kind. "I think it's better we do this honestly without dragging it out." For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the edges blurring into a single suspended second. I could hear the faint buzz of the city below, the soft hiss of wind against glass, the distant clatter of a dropped spoon somewhere behind the bar. Every detail sharpened as if my mind had decided to record this with precision. He held out the envelope. I stepped forward. There are moments in life when emotion surges, when anger or grief demands expression, when people raise their voices or let their tears fall because the alternative feels impossible. This was not one of those moments. What I felt was something quieter, colder, more exact, a kind of stillness that comes when a long-suspected truth finally reveals itself without disguise. I took the envelope, opened it, and scanned the first page. The language was standard: irreconcilable differences, equitable division, signatures required. He had planned this, carefully chosen his timing with intention, and believed with absolute certainty that I would react in a way that justified his narrative. I didn't. Alara, someone murmured behind me, uncertain, sympathetic, unsure whether to intervene. I looked up at Julian. His eyes held mine, searching for something: shock, hurt, anger, anything that would confirm he still had control over how this story would unfold. Instead, I nodded once. "All right," I said. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, subtle but unmistakable. I stepped toward a nearby table, picked up a pen, and without ceremony, without hesitation, I signed my name. The ink flowed smoothly, the letters precise, as if I had been preparing for this longer than he could imagine. A ripple moved through the room: whispers, the soft intake of breath, the unmistakable tension of people witnessing something they did not fully understand. I placed the pen down. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched taut and expectant. Then I met his gaze again, leaned in just enough that only he could hear me, and spoke softly. "You have no idea what you just did." I straightened, handed him the papers, and stepped back. To anyone watching, it might have looked like acceptance, like composure, like a woman choosing dignity over drama. And in a way, it was, but it was also something else entirely, something he would not recognize until it was far too late. The party tried to recover after that. Conversations resumed, though quieter, more cautious. Laughter returned in fragments, forced at first, then gradually more natural as people adjusted to the new reality unfolding in front of them. Julian, to his credit, regained his footing quickly. He thanked a few more colleagues, made a brief joke about life transitions, and allowed the evening to continue as if nothing essential had shifted. I stayed for another 20 minutes, long enough to ensure that my reaction or lack of it became the final impression people carried home with them, long enough for the narrative to settle in a way that would be difficult to rewrite later. When I finally left, the night air was cool, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't quite started yet. I walked to my car without rushing, my heels clicking softly against the pavement, each step measured, deliberate. Inside, the city noise dulled to a distant hum. I sat there for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and allowed myself a single controlled breath. Julian believed he had ended something that no longer served him. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand yet, was that he had also severed the one structure quietly holding his world together. And structures, once removed, don't collapse all at once. They fail in stages, subtly at first, then all at once. I started the engine, 1 month. That was all it would take. The first morning after the party, the flat felt unfamiliar, as if the walls had shifted a fraction of an inch while I slept, and were still deciding whether to hold their shape. London light filtered through the blinds in thin gray ribbons, soft but unyielding, and the city sounded the same as it always did. Traffic easing into motion, a distant siren, a delivery van idling too long. But something fundamental had changed in how I heard it. Noise once background had become detail. Detail once ignorable had become information. Julian had already left. There was a note on the kitchen island, brief and efficient, written in his tight, forward-leaning script. "I'll stay at the Beaumont for a few days. We'll have our solicitors coordinate." No apology, no explanation, no attempt to soften the edges. It was consistent with the version of himself he had chosen to become, decisive, unburdened, convinced that clarity was a substitute for kindness. I poured coffee black, the way I preferred it, and stood by the window overlooking the street. People moved with purpose: commuters, dog walkers, a woman juggling a phone and a pram. And I found myself studying them the way I used to study market data, looking for patterns, for signals that revealed more than they intended. For years, I had lived a parallel life to Julian's, one that ran beneath the surface of his career, like a current steady, invisible shaping outcomes without drawing attention. It had started innocently enough, the way these things often do. He would come home frustrated, a presentation half-formed, a strategy not quite landing, and I would listen, ask a few questions, offer a suggestion. He would try it the next day, see it work, come back with a new problem. Over time, The suggestions became frameworks. The frameworks became drafts. And the drafts became finished work that he delivered as his own. I never insisted on credit. At the beginning, it felt like partnership. Later, it felt like efficiency. By the time it became something else entirely, we had already built a system that neither of us questioned out loud. I set my cup down and moved to the dining table where a stack of old notebooks sat in a neat pile. I opened the top one, flipping through pages filled with diagrams, bullet points, and margin notes. My handwriting, my language, my structure. There were outlines of client pitches, breakdowns of competitive positioning, contingency plans for scenarios that hadn't even occurred to him until I mapped them out. One page in particular caught my attention. At the top, in bold, I had written, Meridian Project Risk Factors and Mitigation. Meridian was his project, the one everyone at the firm had been talking about for weeks. A major corporate restructuring deal, complex, high stakes, the kind of assignment that could define a career. He had been handed it because he was ready, because he had proven himself, because the narrative around him had been carefully cultivated over time. I remembered the night we first discussed it. He had been excited, almost boyish, pacing the living room as he described the scope, the potential upside, the visibility it would bring. There are some gray areas, he had admitted then, almost as an afterthought. Nothing illegal, just aggressive assumptions. The figures can be justified, but they need to be framed the right way. I had asked him to show me everything. He did. What I saw wasn't criminal, not in the obvious sense. It was subtler than that, which made it more dangerous. Revenue projections built on optimistic timelines, cost reductions that depended on variables outside their control, contractual language that allowed for interpretation, just enough flexibility to make the deal appealing, just enough ambiguity to create risk if anyone looked too closely. You can make this work, I had told him that night, but only if you tighten the assumptions and build in safeguards. Otherwise, it holds as long as no one asks the wrong questions. He had nodded, grateful, attentive. And then, over the following weeks, as his confidence grew and the praise started coming in, he stopped bringing the details home. He stopped asking for input. He began to believe the narrative that had been built around him, that he was the architect, not the beneficiary. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. What Julian never understood was that my contribution had never been about individual ideas. It had been about structure, about seeing how pieces fit together, where they were weak, where they could fail under pressure. I didn't just build solutions, I built stability. And stability, once removed, doesn't announce its absence immediately. It reveals itself when something goes wrong. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me back into the present. A message from an unfamiliar number. Alara, this is Alaric Vance from Solstice Partners. We met briefly at the City Finance Conference last year. I was sorry to hear about your situation. If you're open to a conversation, I'd appreciate the chance to catch up. I remembered him, a measured presence in a crowded room, someone who listened more than he spoke, whose questions had cut through surface-level analysis and landed somewhere deeper. Solstice was one of the few firms that could compete directly with Julian's company, known for their precision, their discipline, their unwillingness to overpromise. I considered the message for a moment, then typed a response. I remember. Coffee would be fine. We met 2 days later at a quiet cafe near Lincoln's Inn Fields, the kind of place where conversations linger and no one rushes you out the door. Alaric was exactly as I remembered, calm, observant, his attention steady without being intrusive. I won't pretend this is purely social, he said after we'd exchanged the necessary pleasantries. Meridian is on our radar. We're considering a competing proposal. I assumed as much, I replied. He studied me for a moment, weighing something unspoken. You were involved? He said. Not quite a question. I was adjacent, I answered, choosing the word carefully. Close enough to understand the structure. And the risks. I held his gaze. Significant, I said. Not catastrophic unless they're ignored. He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he had already suspected. I'm not asking you to do anything improper, he added, his tone deliberate. But if you were to consult even informally, your perspective would be valuable. There it was, the opening presented without pressure, without urgency, but with clear intent. "I'm not interested in undermining anyone," I said. "I didn't think you were," he replied. "But there's a difference between undermining and refusing to support something you know is unstable." The distinction mattered. I thought about Julian, about the way he had stood under those lights, confident in a structure he no longer understood. I thought about the pages in my notebook, the safeguards he had dismissed, the assumptions he had stretched just a little too far. "I won't share anything that isn't already implied in the deal itself," I said, "but I can help you ask the right questions." Alaric's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something close. "That's usually enough," he said. Over the next week, we met twice more. Our conversations were precise, focused on frameworks rather than specifics, on stress-testing assumptions rather than exposing secrets. I didn't hand over documents or inside information. I didn't need to. I outlined the kinds of vulnerabilities that deals like Meridian often contain, the pressure points that could be examined without crossing ethical lines. And Alaric, to his credit, understood exactly how to use that. Meanwhile, from a distance, I watched Julian's world continue as if nothing had changed. His name appeared in internal announcements, in industry newsletters, in LinkedIn posts filled with congratulations and admiration. Photos from the promotion party circulated him at the center, glass raised, smile wide. The narrative held intact and convincing. For now. What he couldn't see, what he had never trained himself to see, were the small shifts happening beneath the surface. The missed detail in a report, the assumption left unchallenged, the question he didn't know to ask because no one was there to ask it for him. I didn't need to interfere. I only needed to step back. Because the truth is, I hadn't taken anything from him. I had simply stopped holding it together. And once that support was gone, the structure would begin to show exactly what it was made of. The divorce moved forward with the kind of quiet efficiency that usually signals mutual agreement, or at least the absence of open conflict. Solicitors exchanged documents, revisions were made in careful language, and within 3 weeks, everything that had once defined our shared life was reduced to clean lines on paper. Assets, accounts, obligations, all itemized, all contained. It would have looked to anyone observing from the outside like a reasonable ending between two adults who had simply grown apart. That illusion suited me. Julian didn't contest anything. In fact, we met only once in person during that time. We met at a conference room in a law office in Holborn where neutral tones and soft lighting were designed to keep emotions from rising too high. He arrived 10 minutes late, still in work mode, his phone buzzing intermittently on the table as he silenced notifications without looking at them. "Thanks for making this easy," he said, not unkindly but without depth. "I prefer clarity," I replied. He nodded as if that explained everything. There was a moment brief, almost accidental when our eyes met, and something like recognition flickered there, a trace of the man I had once known. But it passed quickly, replaced by the steady composure he had cultivated for boardrooms and negotiations. "If you need anything," he added, gathering his papers, "let my solicitor know." I almost smiled. "I won't," I said. We signed the final documents in silence, the act itself unremarkable, devoid of ceremony. When it was done, he stood, hesitated for half a second, as if considering whether some closing remark was expected, and then simply left. That was the last time I saw him as my husband. After that, I began the process of removing myself not just from his life, but from the invisible systems that had supported it. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no declarations. Instead, it was a series of small, deliberate withdrawals, threads pulled one by one from a fabric that had long appeared seamless. I stopped responding to late-night texts that had nothing to do with the divorce, but everything to do with habit. Questions about phrasing, about tone, about whether something felt right. At first, they came casually, almost unconsciously, as if he expected the old dynamic to continue by default. Quick thought on this slide. Does this read too aggressive? Can you take a look at this deck? I didn't. Not because I was angry or trying to punish him, but because the boundary had been set, and I intended to honor it fully without exceptions. The messages slowed, then stopped. At the same time, I redirected my own attention outward. Alaric introduced me to two senior partners at Solstice Partners. They both approached our conversations with the same measured professionalism he had shown, curious but cautious, aware of the line between insight and impropriety. I made it clear from the beginning I would not cross that line. What I offered was perspective, not information, structure, not secrets. It turned out that was exactly what they needed. We met in conference rooms that overlooked different parts of the city Shoreditch. Westminster places where glass and steel reflected the same restless energy that had driven Julian's rise. Our discussions were focused, almost surgical in their precision. We examined the Meridian deal from the outside, identifying where assumptions might be stretched, where timelines might compress unrealistically, where external variables could introduce instability. "Walk me through how you'd stress test this," one of the partners asked during our second session, sliding a summarized model across the table. I studied it for a moment, tracing the flow of numbers, the dependencies hidden within them. "You don't challenge the headline projections first," I said. "You start with the supporting layers, the operational shifts, the cost adjustments. If those don't hold, the top line collapses on its own. And if they push back, they will," I replied. "But if your questions are specific enough, they won't be able to dismiss them without exposing the gaps." There was a quiet pause, the kind that signals alignment. "Can you map that out?" he asked. I nodded. By the end of the week, I had a framework, not a blueprint for attack, but a method for examination, a way to apply pressure without overstepping. It was in many ways the same work I had always done, only now it existed in the open, acknowledged, valued for what it was, rather than absorbed into someone else's narrative. Meanwhile, Julian's world continued to move forward on the surface. Through industry updates and the occasional mention from mutual acquaintances, I learned that Meridian was progressing toward its final phase. Internal reviews had gone well, leadership remained confident, and the client was preparing for a formal announcement. His name was attached to every milestone, every success, every forward step. But beneath that, subtle shifts were beginning to emerge. A colleague I still kept in touch with mentioned in passing that Julian had been a little off in recent meetings, missing small details, brushing aside questions that might have benefited from deeper consideration. "He's probably just stretched thin," she added, quick to soften the observation. "Big project, a lot on his plate." "Of course," I said. Another time, I overheard two analysts at a networking event in Mayfair discussing Meridian in general terms. "The model's aggressive," one of them said. "Not wrong, just tight." "Yeah," the other replied. "Feels like it needs one more layer of validation." They didn't know I was connected to it. To them, it was just another deal worth dissecting. But their instincts were accurate, even if they couldn't fully articulate why. What they were sensing were the edges, the places where structures should have been reinforced, where assumptions should have been tested more rigorously, the places where I would have asked questions if I had still been there to ask them. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. The absence of those questions was in itself a kind of pressure. As the weeks passed, Solstice's interest in Meridian sharpened into action. Their competing proposal began to take shape, informed not by inside information, but by disciplined analysis. By asking the kinds of questions that forced clarity, they revealed where confidence was supported by substance and where it was sustained by momentum alone. Alaric kept me updated not in specifics, but in trajectory. "We're positioning ourselves as the safer alternative," he said during one of our later meetings. "Less aggressive, more grounded. It won't be as flashy, but it will hold up under scrutiny." "That's exactly what the situation calls for," I replied. He studied me for a moment. "You're very calm about all of this," he said. I considered the observation. "Calm isn't the absence of feeling," I said. "It's the result of understanding what matters. And what matters here? That the outcome reflects reality, I answered, not perception. He nodded, accepting that without pushing further. By the end of the 4th week, everything was in place. Julian was preparing for the formal presentation that would finalize Meridian, an event that would bring together senior leadership, key stakeholders, and external partners. It was the culmination of months of work, the moment where everything would be affirmed, validated, secured. Solstice would be there as well, not as spectators, as competitors. The night before the presentation, I stood once again by the window in my apartment looking out over the same city that had witnessed the beginning of this unraveling. The lights were steady, the streets alive, the rhythm unchanged. But the structure beneath one man's success had shifted quietly, precisely, in ways he still didn't fully understand. I had not sabotaged him. I had not taken anything away. I had simply stepped back, allowed the systems to operate without the unseen corrections that had once kept them aligned. And in doing so, I had ensured that when the moment came, when the lights were brightest, when the scrutiny was highest, what remained would be exactly what he had built on his own, nothing more, nothing less. The conference center sat along the Thames, all glass and steel, its interior polished to a quiet shine that reflected both the city and the people who came there to prove something. Inside, the air carried that particular tension unique to high-stakes corporate events, measured voices, controlled smiles. The subtle choreography of power as executives, advisors, and clients took their places around long tables and tiered seating. Meridian's final presentation had drawn a full room. Julian stood near the front, speaking with a cluster of senior partners, his posture confident, his gestures precise. He wore a charcoal suit I had helped him choose months ago, tailored to project authority without arrogance, success without excess. He looked exactly the way he was supposed to look. Composed, credible, ready. From across the room, I observed without announcing myself. Solstice's team had arrived together, their presence understated but unmistakable to those who understood the landscape. Alaric stood beside me, reviewing a slim folder, his expression neutral. "You don't have to stay for all of it," he said quietly. "We can handle this." "I know," I replied, "but I think I should." He didn't argue. The session began on schedule. A moderator opened with brief remarks outlining the significance of the Meridian deal, the strategic implications, the anticipated outcomes. Then he invited Julian to present. Applause followed, polite but expectant. Julian stepped forward, his confidence settling into place as naturally as breath. He began with an overview: market conditions, client objectives, the framework his team had developed. His voice carried well, steady and assured, the cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as he had planned. Slides advanced smoothly, charts, projections, carefully structured narratives that built toward a clear, compelling conclusion. The numbers aligned, the story held, and the room responded with attentive silence punctuated by occasional nods from those inclined to agree. If you didn't know where to look, you would have seen nothing but success. Then the questions began. It started with something small, a clarification from one of the external advisors about operational timelines. Julian answered easily, referencing the assumptions built into the model, the contingencies accounted for. A second question followed, slightly more pointed, focusing on cost adjustments under less favorable conditions. He addressed that as well, though his answer carried a fraction more weight, as if he were leaning on the structure rather than moving with it. From beside me, Alaric remained still, his attention fixed on the exchange. A third question came from the far side of the room, delivered by a senior analyst with Solstice. He was someone I recognized from our meetings, though he did not acknowledge me now. "Can you walk us through how those cost reductions hold if the integration timeline extends by even 10%? He asked. It was a precise question. Julian paused just briefly. "The model accounts for variability," he replied, his tone measured. "A 10% extension would be absorbed within the existing margins." "Could you specify where that absorption occurs?" the analyst pressed. A slight shift. Julian advanced the slide, pulling up a breakdown that on its surface supported his claim. He spoke through it, pointing to line items, explaining the interplay between projected savings and operational efficiencies. It was convincing, but not complete. The analyst nodded as if satisfied and leaned back. Another voice entered the conversation, this time from one of the client's representatives. "And if those efficiencies don't materialize on schedule?" she asked. "What's the secondary adjustment?" Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We've built in safeguards," he said. "The structure is designed to adapt." "How?" she asked, her tone still calm but firmer now. A silence opened, not long, not dramatic, but noticeable. From the back of the room, another Solstice team member spoke up, building on the thread. "It seems like a lot of the stability here depends on assumptions holding exactly as projected," he said. "Which is fine, but in our experience, variability tends to compound. I'd be interested in understanding how you mitigate that beyond initial projections." The questions weren't accusations. They were examinations, and each one applied a small, precise amount of pressure. Julian responded, adjusting his language, reinforcing his points, but something had shifted in the rhythm of his presentation. The ease was gone, replaced by a controlled effort to maintain the narrative he had constructed. I watched him carefully. This was the moment I had anticipated, not a collapse in the dramatic sense, but a gradual exposure of the structure beneath the surface. Without the additional layer of scrutiny I had once provided, the model held until it was asked to do more than it had been built to withstand. The moderator glanced at the clock, then back to the room. "Perhaps we should hear from Solstice," he said. "I understand you've prepared an alternative perspective." Alaric stepped forward. "Our approach is slightly different," he began, his voice calm, unhurried. "We focused on building a structure that holds under a wider range of conditions, even if that means more conservative projections up front." He moved through their presentation with quiet precision, outlining a model that addressed the same objectives as Meridian, but with reinforced assumptions, clearer contingencies, and explicit acknowledgement of potential variability. There was nothing flashy about it, but it was solid. Where Julian's proposal required alignment to succeed, Solstice's allowed for deviation without collapse. As Alaric spoke, I could feel the room recalibrating attention, shifting interest, deepening the subtle but unmistakable movement of confidence from one structure to another. When he finished, there was no immediate applause, just silence. The kind that follows when people are reassessing something they thought they understood. The client representatives exchanged looks, then began asking questions again, this time directed at Solstice. Their tone had changed, less probing, more engaged, as if they were exploring a path that felt unexpectedly viable. Julian stood to the side now, his expression controlled but tight, watching as the narrative moved away from him. Finally, the lead client representative spoke. "We appreciate both presentations," she said, her voice steady. "But given the scale of this project, stability is our primary concern. We need to be confident that the structure can withstand variability without introducing additional risk." She paused, then continued. "Based on what we've heard today, we'd like to move forward with Solstice." The decision landed without ceremony. No dramatic flourish, no raised voices, just a shift. Julian's shoulders stiffened, the only outward sign of impact. Around him, the room began to transition, conversations turning, people adjusting their positions, the energy reorienting itself toward the new center of gravity. I stepped forward then, not into the spotlight, but into his line of sight. For a moment, he didn't recognize me, his focus still locked on the outcome, on the unraveling of something he had believed was secure. Then his eyes found mine and recognition struck, sharp and immediate. There are moments when understanding arrives all at once. This was one of them. He looked at me, not with anger, not even with accusation, but with something closer to realization, as if pieces he had kept separate were suddenly aligning into a single, unavoidable truth. I held his gaze. "I didn't take anything from you," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough for him to hear. "I just stopped holding it together." I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. As I turned and walked back toward the exit, The room behind me continued to move, deals being reshaped, conversations beginning anew, the machinery of business adapting to a new reality. Outside, the air was cooler, the Thames reflecting the late afternoon light in fractured patterns. The collapse hadn't been loud. It hadn't needed to be, because what had fallen wasn't built to withstand the truth. In the weeks that followed, the story of Meridian settled into the city the way these things always do, first as a surprise, then as a lesson, and finally as a quiet caution that lingered long after the details faded. There were no headlines, no public scandal, nothing that would draw attention beyond the circles that had been directly involved. But within those circles, the shift was understood clearly enough. Solstice's proposal moved forward, steady and deliberate, exactly as they had promised. Their model held under scrutiny, their timelines adjusted with discipline rather than optimism, and the client's confidence, once uncertain, began to solidify into something lasting. It wasn't the kind of success that generated immediate applause. It was the kind that built trust over time. Julian's firm issued a brief internal statement acknowledging the outcome professional, measured, devoid of blame. Meridian, it said, had evolved in a direction that no longer aligned with their strategic approach. It was the sort of language designed to absorb impact without revealing it. But inside the firm, the reality was harder to contain. A project of that scale doesn't fail quietly among the people who understand what it represents. Questions were asked about assumptions, about oversight, about leadership. Nothing accusatory, not directly, but enough to create distance, enough to shift perception. Julian wasn't dismissed. Not immediately. He had built enough goodwill, enough visible success that the firm chose to recalibrate rather than remove him outright. His responsibilities were adjusted, his scope narrowed, his future reconsidered. In another life, another version of himself might have recognized that as an opportunity to pause, to reflect, to rebuild with greater awareness. But the man he had become didn't yet know how to do that. We didn't speak during that time. Not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left between us that required conversation. The legal process had concluded. The practical ties had been severed. And whatever remained was something he needed to confront on his own. I heard about him indirectly, the way people hear about former colleagues through shared networks, passing mentions, fragments of information that never quite form a complete picture. He was working, still present, still functioning within the structure he had helped build, but not at its center anymore. The narrative around him had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. As for me, my life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply familiar. Solstice offered me a formal role, strategic consulting with a focus on risk analysis and structural integrity. It was in many ways the work I had always been doing, only now it existed in the open, acknowledged, valued without qualification. I accepted. The transition was seamless, not because it was easy, but because it aligned with something I had long understood about myself. I wasn't interested in visibility for its own sake. I didn't need to stand at the front of the room to feel that my work mattered. What I needed, and what I finally had, was clarity, ownership, the simple, unambiguous recognition that what I contributed was mine. The first project I led at Solstice wasn't Meridian, but something smaller, more contained. A company facing restructuring, a set of variables that required careful balance. I approached it the same way I always had, by examining the structure, identifying the points of stress, building in the safeguards that allowed for uncertainty without collapse. It worked. Not perfectly, nothing ever does, but honestly, which matters more? One evening, a few months later, I found myself back at a rooftop bar, not unlike the one where everything had shifted. The skyline was different. This one overlooked a quieter part of the city, but the atmosphere carried the same mix of ambition and celebration, the same sense of people standing at the edge of something they hoped would last. I was there with colleagues this time, not as an observer, but as part of the conversation. Alaric stood beside me, raising his glass in a small, understated toast. To structures that hold, he said. I smiled, the expression genuine, unguarded. To understanding what makes them hold, I replied. As the evening unfolded, I noticed a familiar figure at the far end of the bar. Julian. He looked much the same at first glance, well-dressed, composed, engaged in conversation with a small group, but there was a difference, subtle but unmistakable. The confidence was still there, but it had softened, edged with something quieter, something more reflective. He saw me a moment later. For a brief second, neither of us moved. The distance between us wasn't large, but it was complete, defined not by space, but by everything that had happened in between. He excused himself from his group and walked over, his steps measured. "Elara," he said, "Julian." Up close, the changes were clearer. The sharpness that had once defined him had eased, replaced by something more deliberate, as if he had learned slowly, perhaps reluctantly, that certainty is not the same as understanding. "I've been meaning to reach out," he said. "I wasn't sure if I should." "You're here now," I replied. He nodded, accepting that. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but weighted with things neither of us needed to say. "I understand what happened," he said finally, his voice steady. "Not all of it, maybe, but enough." I considered him for a moment. "And?" I asked. A faint, almost self-aware smile touched his lips. "And I should have understood it sooner," he said. "I thought I was building something on my own. I wasn't. It wasn't an apology, not in the conventional sense, but it was honest." "That's a difficult thing to see," I said. "Yeah," he agreed. "It is." Another pause. "I'm not asking for anything," he added. "I just wanted to say that." "I know," I replied. And I did. We stood there for a moment longer, two people who had once shared a life now connected only by the understanding of how it had ended. "I hope things go well for you," he said. "They already are," I answered, not as a statement of triumph, but of fact. He nodded as if that was exactly what he had expected. "You were right, you know," he said, a faint echo of something like recognition in his voice. "About what?" I asked. "That night," he said. "At the party." A small, quiet moment. "You had no idea what you'd just done," I said, finishing the thought. "Not for him, but for myself." He let out a breath. Something between a laugh and an acknowledgement. "No," he said. "I didn't." And that finally was enough. We parted without ceremony, without lingering, each returning to our respective conversations, our respective lives. There was no reconciliation, no dramatic closure, just a clear mutual understanding of what had been and what no longer was. Later that night, as I stood alone for a moment looking out over the city, I thought about how easily success can be mistaken for self-sufficiency. How often people forget the quiet systems that support them until those systems are gone. Revenge, I realized, is rarely about taking something from someone. More often, it's about allowing them to face the full weight of what they've chosen, without interference, without protection. What Julian lost wasn't something I had taken. It was something he had stopped recognizing the value of. And once that recognition is gone, the loss becomes inevitable. I finished my drink, set the glass down, and turned back toward the room, toward the life I had built. Not in the shadow of someone else's success, but in the clear light of my own. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen, underestimated, or quietly essential, take a moment to reflect on your own value. And don't wait for someone else to recognize it before you do. Share this story with someone who needs that reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about strength, clarity, and the quiet power of knowing your worth, consider subscribing.